It was late 1945, weeks after Japan's formal surrender. Yet the world still moved with the jittery reflexes of a conflict that had not quite unclenched its fists. A three-man Coast Guard inspection team, flashlights in hand, trudged up the warped planks toward a safe house they had been told no longer existed. The structure hunched at the edge of a cliff, boards rotten, windows darkened. The kind of place seagulls avoided and the kind of place bureaucrats insisted had been emptied months ago. But the intelligence memo on Lieutenant Harris's clipboard had been stamped with an urgency rare for peacetime. Unverified reports of Japanese personnel still present. Proceed with caution. The men expected many things: hidden radios, forged passports, maybe even remnants of Japanese naval intelligence. What they did not expect was silence, so complete it pressed against their ears like pressure underwater. Harris pushed the door, surprised when it gave way without resistance. The smell inside wasn't the sharp chemical odor of a workshop. It was something softer, fainter, almost hesitant. Rice left cold, wet fabric, the stale scent of bodies that had not stepped into the sun for too long. Flashlights swept across the room. That was when the beam trembled. In the far corner, huddled like shadows afraid of the light, sat 6 young Japanese women. They were barefoot, wrapped in blankets too thin for the chill, their faces a collage of fear and exhaustion. They did not stand, protest, or run. They simply shrank deeper into themselves. For several seconds, nobody moved, Americans unsure of what they were looking at, and the women bracing for whatever they thought would follow. The first attempt at communication failed instantly. Harris tried English, then broken phrases he remembered from Pacific briefings, but the women stayed silent, their expressions tightening at the sound of a man's voice. Their fear wasn't the ordinary fear of civilians encountering foreign soldiers. It was the fear of people who had learned that uniforms, any uniforms, meant power over their bodies. The Coast Guard officers quickly realized these were not operatives or fugitives. They were victims of something darker. The safe house, once used by Japanese agents as a temporary base for unauthorized coastal monitoring, showed signs of hasty abandonment. Papers half-burned in a stove, a broken shortwave radio on a table, crude supply crates shoved into corners. It didn't take long for the Americans to piece together the outline of what had happened. The Japanese personnel who fled had taken everything except the women. Or perhaps the women had never been considered worth taking. In war, the line between abandonment and disposal often blurred. When the women were escorted outside, the daylight startled them as much as the presence of soldiers. One shielded her eyes with trembling fingers. Another flinched when the wind hit her face, as though even nature had become unfamiliar. They moved slowly, gingerly, as if afraid the earth might give out beneath their feet. These are not spies, not saboteurs. Their bodies told a story their lips could not. Malnutrition, bruising, the kind of hollow gaze common to those who had lived too long under domination. By nightfall, they were transferred to a temporary holding building closer to town, one normally used for processing stranded sailors or intercepted smugglers. But the women did not behave like detainees. They behaved like people unsure whether they had stepped out of captivity or wandered into a new form of it. American nurses brought blankets, water, and ration boxes, but the women stared at each item as if it were part of an unsolvable puzzle. Even hunger seemed muted beneath caution. The central conflict emerged quietly. The Americans had no idea who these women were, and the women had no idea what the Americans intended to do with them. The war had ended on paper, but inside this dimly lit building, distrust still lingered like smoke. Later that evening, when a military translator arrived, the truth began to take shape. The women spoke in hesitant fragments, each sentence a negotiation with their fear. They had been transported by Japanese military handlers months before the surrender, moved from one secret location to another as front lines collapsed. None had volunteered. None had been given a choice. Their captors had fled across the Pacific in desperation, ferrying documents, stolen goods, and, as it now appeared, the women they treated as property. By the time they reached California's coast, Japanese officers had scattered inland or boarded fishing vessels, disappearing into the confusion of surrender. The women had been left in the safe house without food, guidance, or explanation. The American officers listened, their earlier certainty dissolving. Nobody had prepared them for this. The military manuals had pages on espionage suspects, on illegal immigrants, even on enemy sailors washed ashore. But there were no instructions for trafficked, non-combatant nationals discovered on domestic soil after war's end. The women did not fit into any legal category. They were victims, but also citizens of a former enemy nation. They needed help, but help required authority. And authority required classification. In the strange geometry of post-war bureaucracy, their existence itself was a complication. Yet beneath the legal confusion, a subtler crisis was taking shape. The women did not trust the food placed before them. Rationed biscuits, canned vegetables, powdered eggs, none triggered recognition. They poked at the plates cautiously, almost apologetically, unable to reconcile the unfamiliar ingredients with memories of the kitchens they once knew. Hunger drove them to nibble at corners of bread, but every bite looked like an act of bravery rather than nourishment. To them, meals given by uniformed men had never been associated with kindness. A nurse, watching the untouched trays, whispered to Harris, "They look like they don't even recognize this as food." She was right. Trauma had rewired their instincts. Food was no longer comfort. It was a reminder of lost control. This small, unspoken fear wrapped itself around the room, giving the Americans their first real glimpse into how much had been taken from these women. As night deepened and the building settled into uneasy quiet, one detail still bothered Harris. Even after hours of tension, the women's eyes kept drifting, not to the door, not to the guards, but to the corner where a battered box of rice sat beside a pantry shelf, left over from the building's previous occupants. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to spark recognition, however faint. And as he watched them glance toward it again and again, Harris understood something simple yet unsettling. The conflict they were facing was not just about safety or identity. It was about the basic human need to reclaim even the smallest piece of a life taken from them. That realization would lead to a decision none of them expected. One that began not with politics or paperwork, but with the quiet, trembling hope that a familiar grain of rice could help a shattered person feel human again. The untouched ration trays sat on the metal table like small, silent accusations, reminding everyone in the room that the war's end did not magically reset the human heart. The women watched the unfamiliar food with an almost ritual stillness, their eyes darting from item to item, as if each ingredient carried a hidden warning. Hunger was not the barrier. Memory was. The Americans understood this now, though none could yet articulate the full weight of what it meant. All they knew was that the investigation had to begin immediately, not to determine guilt, but to understand the truth. When Lieutenant Harris returned with a Japanese-American translator named Kenji Tanaka, a former sergeant recently reassigned to post-war civil affairs, the atmosphere shifted. The women didn't shrink from him. They studied him with cautious recognition, hearing the familiar cadence of their mother tongue emerging from a uniformed man's mouth. It didn't erase their fear, but cracked its surface. For the first time, someone in the room sounded human to them. The questioning was delicate, every sentence a slow excavation. Kenji kept his voice soft, carefully spacing his words. He had heard war stories before, from both sides of the Pacific, but the silence that followed each of the women's fragmented answers unsettled him. These pauses weren't hesitation. They were calculations of safety. Their stories came in slivers, of ships taken without explanation, of rooms locked from the outside, of orders barked by men who offered no names. They did not describe themselves as prisoners. They did not describe themselves at all. They spoke as people who had been made into objects, transported like cargo, simply because someone had the power to do so. Medical examinations corroborated what their words only hinted at. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, scarring likely caused by years of forced confinement. Trauma that manifested physically: hesitant breathing, stiff posture, the reflexive flinch when a door clicked shut. The American nurses recorded everything with clinical precision. But behind the documentation was a quiet fury, the kind that grew when evidence revealed more cruelty than testimony could capture. The military administrators found themselves in an unexpected bind. According to the Office of Naval Intelligence Protocols, any foreign nationals discovered on U.S. soil had to be identified, classified, and processed. But these women didn't fit the categories in the manual. They were neither immigrants, nor detainees, nor spies, nor refugees in the official sense. Their presence was a loose end in a post-war world trying desperately to tie itself back into order. Reports were filed up the chain of command, each version more uncertain than the last. Victims of trafficking, one officer wrote hesitantly, unsure if such terminology was even used in military paperwork of the era. Another report described them as non-combatant persons unlawfully transported by enemy agents. The language felt too cold for lives so violently uprooted. The truth was simple. No one knew what to call them because no one had anticipated a situation like this. Kenji, however, sensed the deeper dilemma. The women were caught between identities: Japanese citizens without a homeland to return to safely, victims of Japanese military exploitation, and now people under American protection. They were neither enemies nor allies. They were survivors stranded in a nation they had never intended to see. Identity itself had become a battlefield. The Americans tried small gestures to ease the tension. A nurse placed a cup of warm broth on the table, but the women waited until she stepped back before touching it. A young officer brought blankets that still carried the faint scent of detergent, and the women accepted them with careful nods. One even whispered arigato, the word trembling like a fragile leaf. These moments were proof of shifting ground, suspicion melting by degrees rather than disappearing altogether. Yet misunderstandings persisted, some tragic, some darkly humorous. When a corporal handed them spoons, the women examined the utensils as though unsure what part of the hand they were meant to occupy. One woman attempted to eat canned peaches by pinching them with her fingertips, unable to reconcile the sticky syrup with anything she recognized as edible. Another tried to stir powdered eggs with the solemn focus of someone handling an unstable chemical. The Americans watched, awkwardly hoping their presence didn't make things worse. These small stumbles revealed something important. Without familiar food, familiar tools, and familiar rhythms, even the act of eating felt foreign to them. They were adrift, not only in geography, but in their own bodies. The Americans were beginning to understand the origins of that fear, though only in fragments. After 2 days of interviews, one detail stood out above all others. Whenever Kenji asked about their lives before being taken, their voices faltered at the same moment. When describing the kitchens they had once worked in or cooked for, there was something sacred in those memories, something that outlived the years of captivity. Fire crackling under pots, steam rising from rice, the scent of miso or fish stock. These recollections were spoken with more emotion than any other part of their testimony. Food, it seemed, had been their last tie to a life that once belonged to them. That realization became the hinge on which the investigation shifted. They were not simply identifying who these women were. They were uncovering who they had been before the war attempted to erase their identities altogether. The Americans began to see them not as displaced foreign nationals, but as individuals whose sense of self had survived quietly in the memories of dishes they once cooked. When Harris returned that evening, he found the women gathered near the pantry shelf again, staring at the same box of rice he had noticed earlier. The box hadn't moved, but the meaning it carried had. It wasn't just food, it was belonging, recognition, a signal that somewhere inside them, the thread of identity had not snapped. And as Harris watched them, their faces lit only by the dim yellow lamp above, he realized something had changed irreversibly. Not in military files, but in the air itself. The investigation was no longer about classification. It was about restoration. What he didn't yet know was that this shift quiet as it seemed, would lead to a decision that would challenge every protocol on the books. A decision that began with the simple, almost reverent way the women looked at that box of rice, as if it held the key to a life stolen and waiting to be reclaimed. The kitchen was hardly more than a converted storage room, a narrow space wedged between the infirmary and a supply closet that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old soap. Its single window overlooked the yard where military vehicles rumbled in and out all day. Yet to the women led inside by Nurse Margaret Hale that morning, it might as well have been a sacred room forgotten by history. They stepped across the threshold slowly, like pilgrims entering a shrine, their eyes widening at the simplest sights. Pots stacked neatly on a shelf, a wooden cutting board, a battered kettle still carrying the faint aroma of boiled water. Margaret had been the first to suggest this. She wasn't a policymaker or an officer. She simply paid attention. She had seen the way the women's gazes lingered on the rice box, how their silence softened when they spoke about food from home, how their bodies loosened slightly when the conversation turned to flavors they once knew. She told Harris that identity, once shattered, didn't return through interrogation reports or medical checkups. It returned through routines, through rituals, through small things that made a person feel like themselves again. Harris took a long breath, weighed the risk, and then signed the paper allowing supervised use of the kitchen. It was a permission that technically shouldn't have existed, but then again, neither should the situation they were in. When the women entered, they froze as if uncertain whether they were really allowed to move freely in the space. Kenji stepped forward and explained gently that they could touch whatever they wished, that the room was theirs for the morning. His words hung in the air with the weight of possibility. One woman reached out and ran her fingers over the edge of a pot, tracing its cool metal surface with something close to reverence. Another cupped her hands around a wooden spoon, testing its balance as though reacquainting herself with a language she hadn't spoken in years. Margaret placed a small assortment of ingredients on the counter: rice, dried seaweed, miso paste acquired with difficulty from a Japanese-American grocer, and vegetables donated by a local family who had heard that foreign women needed help. The women stared at the ingredients not with hunger, but with disbelief. It was the first time since their captivity that they had been allowed to assemble food rather than be forced to consume it. When the first woman lit the stove, the shift in the room was immediate. Flames crackled to life, soft and steady, the sound oddly comforting. They weren't loud flames, not the roaring fires of military ovens. This was the gentle hiss of domestic life, a fire meant not for survival, but for nourishment. The women exchanged glances, and for the first time since being found, their expressions softened into something resembling relief. Steam rose as water warmed. The scent of rice blooming in the pot filled the room slowly, like memory drifting in on an invisible tide. One woman closed her eyes, as though inhaling something sacred. Another began slicing vegetables with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate, almost ceremonial. This was not mere cooking. This was reclaiming. Margaret and Harris stood at the doorway, watching quietly. The transformation unfolding in front of them wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be, but it was profound. The women's shoulders no longer curled inward. Their hands stopped trembling. Their voices, soft, hesitant, began to weave through the room in brief exchanges, stitching fragments of forgotten normalcy back into place. There were moments of gentle humor. One of the women tried to teach a young American officer named Collins how to pronounce dashi, and he failed spectacularly, much to their restrained amusement. Another watched Harris attempt to eat a piece of seaweed with the earnest bravery of someone stepping into unknown culinary territory. For a brief moment, the war felt impossibly distant. When the rice finished steaming, the women gathered around the pot, as if around a hearth. One of them, the youngest, scooped a portion into a bowl with a care that spoke of years in which care had been withheld from her. She offered it to Margaret first, a gesture of thanks so unexpected that Margaret nearly teared up. The others prepared small dishes, combining familiar flavors into something simple but deeply meaningful. Rice balls with seaweed, miso soup with thinly sliced vegetables, broth seasoned with the precision of those who had once cooked out of love, not survival. As they ate, something intangible shifted. These were not detainees sharing a meal with their captors. These were people rediscovering dignity in the presence of those who finally recognized their humanity. Even Harris, normally reserved, felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't protocol. This was restitution, even if unofficial, even if small. Kenji took notes as the women talked, details about their villages, the dishes they grew up making, the meals they remembered most vividly. Their stories flowed more freely now, tethered to memory rather than fear. He realized that food had become a bridge, carrying them from silence into recognition. For the first time, they were not simply recounting trauma. They were revealing who they were beyond it. But beneath the gentle warmth of the kitchen, a deeper question simmered. Identity, though resurfacing, remained fragile. The women were still in a country not their own, tied to legal systems that didn't yet know what to call them. They had found comfort in a room with 4 walls and a stove, but comfort was not the same as certainty. The future remained a vast, uncharted ocean, and none of them knew what lay across it. As the meal ended, the women cleaned the pots with quiet efficiency, as though honoring a ritual they feared might be taken away at any moment. Their hands moved with confidence now, not caution. They were no longer just survivors. They were themselves again, if only in fragments. Then, as they stepped out of the kitchen, one of them paused and looked back at the stove, her gaze lingering on the still warm pot. Her expression held gratitude, yes, but also longing and something else. A question, a hope, a fear of what would come next. And in that lingering look, Harris understood that the kitchen had done more than restore their past. It had reminded them they still had a future, and now the burden fell on him and the government he served to decide what that future would be. The morning air outside the facility carried a faint chill, the kind that hinted at distant seasons shifting even when the world felt stubbornly stuck between past and future. The women stood near the doorway, wrapped in the same faded blankets they had been given on their first night, but now their faces held a softness that had not been there before. The kitchen had changed something within them, smoothing the hard edges of fear and revealing a quiet resolve that startled even those who had watched it unfold. Yet the question that hung over all of them remained painfully unanswered. What now? The U.S. authorities had spent weeks debating the matter, the case moving from local command to regional offices, then climbing slowly toward Washington as if navigating a bureaucratic staircase with steps uneven and uncertain. Every department seemed to agree on one fact. These women did not fit into any known category. They were not prisoners of war, since they had never taken up arms. They were not immigrants, as they had never asked to come. They were not refugees in the formal sense, though their suffering matched the stories of those fleeing ruined homelands. They were, above all else, victims, an uncomfortable truth for officials accustomed to paperwork where every line had a neat box beside it. Lieutenant Harris, who had first opened the door of the safe house weeks earlier, found himself advocating in meetings he had never planned to attend. He argued not from protocol, but from experience. The experience of seeing these women reclaim a fragment of their identities through the simple act of boiling rice. They deserve a say in their future, he insisted, more than once. Haven't they earned at least that? His superiors listened, some with sympathy, others with the uneasy pragmatism of officials trained to think in consequences rather than conscience. Meanwhile, life within the building settled into a rhythm. The women cooked in the small kitchen twice a week under supervision, creating dishes that filled the hallways with scents unfamiliar to American noses but comforting to their own. Margaret often joined them, watching with admiration as they moved with growing confidence. Kenji continued his interviews, though he soon realized the formal questioning was less important than the conversations that bloomed naturally over simmering broth and steamed vegetables. The women were not simply remembering who they were redefining it. But the matter of repatriation hovered over everything. Japan was under Allied occupation now. Cities lay in ruins. Families were displaced. Social stigma weighed heavily on women associated with, as if carrying pieces of the kitchen with them. On their final night in the facility, they cooked one last meal. The aroma drifted through the building, richer and more confident than any before. The Americans gathered at the doorway, unsure whether to join or simply observe. The women chose for them, offering bowls of steaming rice and miso soup with shy but genuine smiles. It was a farewell without ceremony, just warmth, gentle conversation, and the quiet understanding that something rare had occurred between strangers shaped by opposite sides of a war. Before dawn, they boarded the transport truck that would take them to the port. The yard was still, the sky washed in pale gray. Harris stood beside the vehicle, uncertain of what to say. The women bowed, each in her own way. The youngest lifted her hand slightly before lowering it, her eyes glistening with gratitude she had no words for. Margaret hugged them one by one, her breath trembling though she tried to hide it. Kenji offered each of them a slip of paper that listed contact names in Japan, people who would help them when they arrived. As the truck pulled away, the women glanced back at the small window of the kitchen, its glass catching the faint glow of morning. It had become more than a room. It had been the doorway through which they stepped back into themselves. And now, as the vehicle rumbled toward the coastline, they carried that reclaimed identity with them, fragile but real. For a long moment, the Americans stood in silence, watching until the truck disappeared down the road. No one spoke. There were no triumphant declarations, no celebratory salutes, only the quiet knowledge that something had been set right in a world still struggling to find balance. But even as they turned to leave, Harris felt a faint unease thread through the morning calm. Repatriation would offer safety, perhaps even healing. Yet it also carried shadows, social judgment, political uncertainty, the weight of memories that the wartime system of exploitation, even those forced into it. Returning home meant stepping into uncertainty as vast as the Pacific itself. And yet America was not home, nor could it truly become one. The women found themselves caught between two worlds, both shaped by forces beyond their control. It was during a late afternoon meeting, the sun angling low across stacks of case files, that the decision finally took shape. A recommendation had arrived from Washington, measured, cautious, but clear. The women would be repatriated to Japan under the supervision of the American Red Cross and the Repatriation Bureau in Yokohama. There would be medical care, transitional housing, and assistance in locating surviving relatives. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a humane one. And most importantly, it included a condition rarely granted in such cases. The women would be given a choice in how and when the journey occurred. When Harris and Kenji explained the decision to them, the room fell silent. The women listened with expressions that shifted from fear to confusion to a fragile, lingering hope. One asked whether they would be punished in Japan. Another asked whether America would force them to leave. A third, the eldest, asked the question none of the officials had anticipated. If we return, will we still be ourselves? Kenji struggled to answer. Margaret stepped in quietly. You are yourselves now, she said. No one can take that from you again. That statement, gentle but firm, settled over the room like a promise. And slowly, one by one, the women nodded. Preparations began immediately. The Americans arranged medical evaluations, secured transport papers, and coordinated with the Red Cross ship's schedule for departure. The women were given modest clothing, simple dresses, sturdy shoes, and small personal bags for their belongings. They packed carefully, folding blankets they had grown attached to, and tucking handwritten recipes into their pockets. Did not vanish simply because a ship crossed the ocean. The women were heading toward a homeland, rebuilding from ashes, a homeland that might not understand where they had been or what they had endured. And as he walked back toward the building, Harris couldn't shake the sense that their journey, though hopeful, was far from over. Sometimes freedom began with a pot of rice. But what came after was a different kind of battle, one fought not with armies, but with the courage to rebuild a life that had nearly been erased. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.